So today we're doing the homework, or see, not the homework, we're doing the weighted voting and power measure stuff. Don't forget by Friday at 5 to take that test online too. I'll talk more about that at the end. So weighted voting is what we're going to look at right now. In the previous few sections, we've treated every voter as getting one vote, okay? But there are situations in which we don't want everyone, excuse me, excuse me. And something stuck in my throat. So there are situations in which we don't want everybody to have the same count. All right. The classic example of this is ownership of a company. Oftentimes, certain individuals will own a majority of a company, and there might be lots of other individuals that own smaller portions of that company. Also, there are situations in which some people are just more invested in certain decisions than others. And obviously, there's some decisions that only apply to certain groups or certain people. Like, for instance, I don't need you all to vote on what I get to eat for dinner tonight, right? Because you're not going to be very invested in, you're not going to care what I eat for dinner. And, unless you're coming over to my house, what I eat doesn't even matter to you, right? So things of that nature, things where, and obviously that's an extreme case, but there are situations in which certain people aren't quite as invested in a decision, right? There's a lot of those other cases, too, where you could argue that because those people aren't as invested in the decision, they're not making the best choices, right? So you don't want them to have an equal weight. Okay. So the terminology that we're going to use in this chapter is weight. Well, there's a lot of different terminologies, but the weight of a voter is how many votes that they get. So I, as a voter, might get a certain number of votes. You, as a voter, might get a certain number of votes. And we're going to vote in this chapter on a basic yes-no proposition or a pass-fail proposition. So we're only going to be given two options. Yes, no, pass, fail. The quota is going to be the number of votes we need to pass the decision or to say yes to the decision. Now, the quota is always going to be at least 50%, but sometimes it's higher than that. And sometimes it's a lot higher than that. There are certain decisions where you only want something to happen if there's a super majority on board. Now, in other books, you'll see this notation where they'll put Q for quota, and then they'll list all of the weights of the voters. Typically, we just put that in a table form or something of that nature. So typically that notation, in this, I usually just put it in table form, but if you read along in certain other books, you'll see that notation, quota, and then listing out all the weights. And whenever we say a coalition, all we're talking about is a group of people who are voting in the same way. A coalition is a group of people who, I should say, potentially could vote in the same way. All right? So this is how it works. Each voter is assigned their weight, how many votes they get. They're gonna vote on one of two outcomes. They can either pass or fail a motion. Or they can say yes or no, right? Something like that. We're generally gonna be using the pass-fail notation here. So think that we have an ownership in a company and the company is trying to do some action. And the board wants, or excuse me, the board wants to do some action and we get to say yes or no to that action, which is just pass or fail. Now, each voter is gonna put all their votes on either pass or fail. And if the pass votes hit the quota or exceed the quota, then the motion passes. If the pass votes do not hit the quota or exceed the quota, then the motion fails. All right. Is that pretty easy concept? Hopefully. Now, a couple more definitions. A winning coalition is just a group of people who have enough votes where if all of them voted together, they pass the motion. A blocking coalition is a group of voters who, if they all vote to fail, make sure that the motion fails. Does that make sense? So a winning coalition is a group of voters who have enough votes to win, to pass the motion. A blocking coalition is a group of voters who have enough votes to defeat the motion. If they all vote fail, it doesn't go through. All right. So let's give an example here. Let's say there's a company out there with 6 voting members. And you can see that their weights are 10, 4, 2, 1, and 1. Now we're going to assume the quota is 10. That means if 10 votes to pass happen, then the motion passes. Now, if the vote had person A and person C voting to pass, A and C together have 12 votes. And they're all of them, all 12 votes are to pass. Since the quota is 10, and there are 12 passing votes, the motion passes. All right. So there you go. Now I want to point out something. A already had 10 votes, right? C had 2, and that's where we got the 12. By the way, that means A and C together form a winning coalition. They're a winning coalition because their votes added 12 and the motion passed because of that. Everybody follow that? Now, A and C are not the only winning coalition. In fact, because A had 10 votes, if A were the only individual that voted to pass, A has 10 votes. The quota is 10. So the motion passes. Good, follow that? So while A and C together are a winning coalition, A is actually a winning coalition by itself, by himself, herself, whatever. All right, so just A alone is a winning coalition. A and C together are still a winning coalition too, don't get me wrong. Does that make sense? So that's how weighted voting works. As long as you hit that quota with passing votes, the motion passes. Now that we've done that example, I want to talk about a couple of other terms you might hear in weighted voting. One of the terms you might hear is a dictator. A dictator is an individual with votes exceeding the quota or at the quota. So a dictator is someone who by themselves forms a winning coalition. Veto power is an individual who can block any motion. It's one individual who can block any motion. And then on the other end of the spectrum, a dummy voter is essentially a voter with no power. It means if they ever switch sides, it doesn't matter to the overall outcome of the vote. The outcome of the vote never changes depending on what side they're on. Another way to say a dictator is that it's an individual who by themselves form a winning coalition. Veto power is an individual who by themselves forms a blocking coalition. So in our example, A was a dictator because, like I said, if A votes to pass by themselves, they hit the quota, so the motion passes. A by themselves is a winning coalition. A happens to also have veto power, because if you add up all of the other votes, you get to a 9. And so if A votes to fail and everybody else votes to pass, they can only get up to 9. Right? So A is a dictator and also has veto power. Now that means that a voter like voter C is a dummy voter. No matter what C votes for or against, it really doesn't matter. There's no way that C can change the outcome of a vote. So C is a dummy voter here, right? So A is a dictator and has veto power, and C is a dummy voter, but it turns out all the other voters are. If you have a dictator, all the other voters are dummy voters. So technically B, C, D, E, and F are all dummy voters. They're never going to sway the outcome. Let's do another example. All right, the quota here is 20. And voter A votes to pass, voter B votes to pass, voter D votes to pass. Obviously, we have a different weight distribution system. So A, B, and D, A, B, D, together have 10, 16 plus 5 is 21 votes. Therefore, since they all voted to pass, the motion is going to pass. So A, B, D vote to pass. Now, motion's going to pass in this case. But let's take a step back and decide if there's a dictator, if there's an individual with veto power, if there's a dummy voter with a quota of 20. Okay. If I add up all of these weights, the total weight is 29. Okay, so just keep that in the back of your head real quick. So notice if the total weight is 29, this quota, I just wanted to point out, is well above 50%. Okay, 15 would be above 50%. Does that make sense? So oftentimes we can have quotas that are above 50%. I just wanted to put that out there. So dictator. Let's go to our definition of dictator. Dictator is an individual whose vote count meets or exceeds the quota. We have no individual that gets us up to 20. No individual person so there is no dictator. In this system. So you ask, well, what about veto power? Is there an individual who, if they vote against, everybody else can't add up to 20? And it turns out A has veto power. A has 10 votes. Everyone else together has 19. So if everyone else together cannot add up to the quota for everybody else, if A votes against, the max everybody else can get is 19. We need 20 for our quota, right? So if A votes against, they block. So A is not a dictator, but they do have veto power. Everybody get that? And then dummy voter. Well, a dummy voter is, excuse me, an individual where if they vote a different way can change the outcome. There are ways to do that. For every single individual, other than E, actually. Now, I'm not going to go and list off all the winning coalitions, but it turns out E having that one vote never can actually make a difference. If you looked at getting up to 20, you have to take A and then plus 2 out of 3 of the B, C, or D. That makes sense? So you have to get 2 of these individuals, B, C, D, along with A, to get a winning vote. And if you add in E, it really doesn't matter ever. Does that make sense? So dummy voter technically is, but don't worry about that too much. We'll get into winning coalitions in a little bit. So let's talk about the winning coalitions. I kind of was mentioning that earlier. The winning coalitions are the coalitions, the groups that add up to 20. I'll write some of those down on the board. So like I said, we need 20. So technically we need A and 2 other individuals. A, B, C would be a winning coalition. A, B, D would be a winning coalition. But A, B, E would not be. right? That only gets us up to 17. So ABC is a winning coalition. ABD, well, now I've done AB and I've tried the other three, right? So now let's do AC and then try to add one. If I try AC, I don't have to add B because I already had B in there earlier. So ACD, yeah, that works. ACD. ACE only gets me up to 18. That does not work. So ACD works. So I don't know if you see what I'm doing. I'm kind of taking all of my triples. And if what I do, I kind of think of it this way. I start with 3 dots. Actually, let me do a different color. And I say, in a systematic way, if I'm looking at all through the triples, I say, okay, let's try ABC. Those are the first 3. And then I move the red dot over and say, let's try ABD. That one worked. And then I move the red dot over and I say, okay, let's try ABE. That one did not work, right? Once I get to the end with the red dot, I can go back to the front and move my green one over. And then the red dot always has to stay to the right of the green. Does that make sense? So I start over, I check this one, ACD. That works, so I write it down. Then I move this red one over. ACE does not work, so I don't write that one down. Now my red dot's at the end, and go back, move my green one over. Check that, ADE. That does not work. You don't get up to 20 with that. You get like 17. And now that both of these 2 dots are at the end, now I can go move the blue one over. And that means I'm not including A, and we already decided that not including A always fails, right? So these are the only winning coalitions of size 3. Everybody got that? You can check all the other ones if you want to, but we all know that if you don't include A, it's gonna fail. And then I say, well, let's check all the coalitions of size 4. For just a second. I forgot what I had. Oh, blue, yeah. So checking all the coalitions of size 4, I could do the same thing. Say, okay, A, B, C, D. Does that work? Yeah, that works. In fact, I know that's just adding another letter to this one, or adding another letter to this. So A, B, C, D works. Move that red dot over. About A, B, C, E. Yeah, that works. A, B, C, E. In fact, that's just this one where we added the E. Okay. And now I can go back, move the green dot over. A, B, D. Yeah, that's got to work. A, B, D, E. That's this one, just added the E. And now that the green and red are all the way over, I go back, move the blue over. A, C, D, E. That works too. That's actually just A, C, D, E plus the letter E. And then I go back and I check this one, B, C, D, E. That adds up to 19. That's what I was saying, everything other than A adds up to 19, so that does not work, so I don't write it down. Okay. So that's all I checked all my groupings of size 3. I checked all my groupings of size 4. And then the group of size 5, well, there's only one group of size 5, including all the letters. So A, B, C, D, E is also a winning coalition. So those are all the different winning coalitions in this example, right? I just go through every single option. Technically, I go through every single option of 1, but it's really easy to see that they don't add up to 20. And then I go through every single pair, but there's no pair that adds up to 20. And then I start triplets, and I look at all the triplets. And these 3 added up to 20, but those were the only triplets that worked. Those were the only sets of size 3. The sets of size 4 that worked were here, and there's one set of size 5 and that worked, obviously. So that's a list of all the winning coalitions in this example. Does that make sense? So all of the winning coalitions, I just look at all the groups that add up to 20. Listing those things out is going to be important for some stuff we do later. Now, I'm not going to do this by hand, but if we try to list out all of the blocking coalitions, there's going to be a lot more of them because remember, this system only had 29 votes. Therefore, every group which has 10 votes forms a blocking coalition. Does that make sense? Why? Every group that forms 10 votes would form a blocking coalition. And there's going to be a lot more groups that form 10, that together have 10 votes. There's going to be A by itself does, and then there's lots of different pairs that do, lots of different triples that do, lots of different groups of size 4. In fact, all the groups of size 4, and then group of size 5. So there's a lot more blocking coalitions because you only need to get up to 10. Everybody follow that to make sure it blocks. Oh. So winning coalitions have to add to at least 20. And then the blocking coalitions, those are the ones that have to add to at least 10. In this example. Oh, all right. Everybody understand why it's 10? In order for you to not get the quota of 20, 10 people have to vote against. Right, follow that? 10 votes. I don't mean 10 people, but 10 votes have to go against. So since we have a total weights in the system of 29 and the quota of 10, blocking coalitions are all the ones that add up to at least 10. All right. Now we're gonna have one more definition here, and this definition is going to lead to our power measures, to the concept of power measures. And that definition is the term critical player. Or you can also write critical voter. So critical player, you might also hear a critical voter. So a critical player in a winning coalition is one where their votes are actually needed to win. Another way of saying that is that if they dropped out, the coalition would no longer win. Everybody get that? A critical player is an individual who, if they drop out of a winning coalition, that winning coalition now does not win. So let's look at a couple of examples that we listed out earlier. So ABC and then ACD, check those two out. Now I forgot, I gotta do, sorry about that. 10, 6, so just so we're on the record, A has 10 votes, B has 6 votes, C has 7, D had 5, and E had 1. That's not important in terms of, I can still figure it out without knowing that. Still figure out critical players. So we're looking at our first winning coalition, the ABC, and we want to find critical players. If A drops out, then only B and C are left. They don't add to 20. Therefore, A is a critical player. If they drop out, they no longer win. The easy way to see that is after you've listed out all of the winning coalitions, just is BC up there as a winning coalition? Obviously it's not, right? So A was important. Let's check out B. B is worth 6. If B drops out, we're only left with AC. That gets us up to 17. AC is not a winning coalition. So B was also necessary for ABC. Again, you can think of it like here, we've listed out all of our winning coalitions. If I erase B, do I see an AC in the winning coalitions? No. So B is critical because if B drops out, the coalition is no longer a winning coalition. If C drops out, AB is not listed out in my winning coalitions, so C is also critical. All right. So in the coalition ABC, A, B, and C are all critical. Now let's look at the other coalition I had listed on that slide, A, C, D, E. Sure, I got that, A, C, D. All right, let's look at A. If I drop out A, I'm left with C, D, E. C, D is not a winning coalition, so A was important. A is critical. How about C? If I drop out C, I'm looking for A, D, E. That's not up there, is it? So A, D, E not being up there means C was needed. And so C is critical. If I drop out D, I get ACE. That is not in my winning coalitions. Therefore, D was needed as well. D is critical. And then I look at E. Drop out E, I'm left with A, C, D, right? That is up there. So E is not really needed. So E is not critical. So if we listed out all of our winning coalitions, it's pretty easy to see which one's critical, which one's not. Just pretend it doesn't exist and then ask, does that still win? Does that still win? Does that still win? If it doesn't win, then the individual was necessary and therefore critical. If it still wins, then the individual was not necessary. Now, let me look at one other. That I didn't have up there as a winning coalition. Let's do all 5 of them, the winning coalition A, B, C, D, E. All right. If I drop out A, so drop A, I'm just left with B, C, D, E. That is not up there, right? So A is critical to this winning coalition. If I drop out B, I'm left with A, C, D, E. A, C, D, E already exists up here, so B is not critical. With all that, you drop B, it's still winning. So B not critical. C, I drop it out, I get A, B, D, E. A, B, D, E is already up there. So you drop out C, C is not important in to this winning coalition. And again, we're just dropping out one at a time. You don't drop out multiples. And B and C together would be critical, but we're talking about individual letters. Our individual letter is critical. Drop out D. So I drop out D, I get A, B, C, E. That's in there already. So D could have dropped out and we'd still have a winning coalition. D is not critical. And then E drops out, A, B, C, D still works, so E is also not critical. So, excuse me. So you can see sometimes every individual is a critical player in a winning coalition. And you can see sometimes that there are a lot of individuals that are not critical to the coalition. And it doesn't happen here, but there are scenarios in which none of the individuals are critical. It doesn't happen in this example, but there are times where there's no critical players at all in a certain winning coalition. Right? So they always have to be critical to the coalition. That work? All right. And obviously, some players are going to be critical to some coalitions and not critical to others. Oh, shoot. One other thing that I wanted to mention before I move on. I said A, B, C are critical, all critical here. Technically, D and E are by default not critical to A, B, C because they're not in there, right? So if I drop them out, there's no change. So just for the sake of argument, if an individual is not in a winning coalition, it's by default not critical to that winning coalition because dropping them out doesn't do anything. All right. So that's the idea. Okay. I think I'm going to skip example 3, listing out all the critical winning coalitions and then critical players, because we're going to do a lot of that in the next section. All right. So this idea of critical players leads us to the concept of power measures. How do we measure power? In our previous example, the one I had written on the board, E had a vote, but it turns out E never really mattered. If you looked at all of the winning coalitions which had E and then erased E, it'd still be winning coalitions. That's another definition of a dummy voter, is you're never critical. Okay. So first off, we want to think about what power actually is in terms of voting power. Power is the ability to produce an effect. It means essentially how much control do you have over the system? If you're a dictator, you have all the power, right? You have total control over the system. Whatever you do determines what the system does. But if you're a dummy voter, you don't have any control over the system. You have no ability to make any change in voting. Now, a lot of people mistakenly just say, well, power just must be the weight of my vote. You know, I have one vote out of 29, therefore, I have 1/29 of the power. So one way to try that many people try to figure out power is they just take the percentage of the votes. If in Michigan there's 9 million people voting for senator, or maybe let's say there's 5 million people to vote for senator, and I have 1 out of the 5 million, my power is 1 out of 5 million. Right? But we see that that's not going to be a very good judgment of power, because if you remember back to the very first example, we had 19 votes. A had 10 out of 19 votes. So the weights over total would be 10 over 19. C had 2 over 19. And D would have had 1 over 19 of the total votes. So weights, so that would be the weight over total. Does that make sense? In this example, A has 10 over 19. C has 2 over 19. D has 1 over 19. Okay. But weights aren't exactly the same thing as power. Remember, the quota was 10, and A was a dictator in this system. So weights by themselves are not the same thing as power. They don't directly correlate. We wouldn't say 8 has 10 out of 19, 10/19 of the power. They have 100% of the power. And you wouldn't want to say C has 2 over 19 or 2/19 of the power. And C has no power. C's a dummy voter, right? So weights don't make a good power measurement. Weights don't represent how much effect of change you have on the system. So while you can use weights as a substitute for power, it's not a very good way to do that. Okay. Now, there are different ways to measure power of a system. Two famous ones are the Banzhaf Power Index and the Shapley-Shubik Power Index. right? There are others as well. The only one that we're gonna look at in our class is the underlying one, the Banzhaf Power Index. And the Banzhaf Power Index is the only one we're gonna look at. But here's how it works. We're gonna list out all the winning coalitions. And then we're gonna see how often a voter is a critical player in all of those winning coalitions, right? And if they're a critical player 50 times, then we say that their critical count is 50. That makes sense? And then we sum all of the critical counts over all the voters. And that becomes our denominator. So the critical count of the individual voter divided by all of the critical counts put together is the Banzhaf Power Index. Now, the thing that takes a bit of time is listing out all of the winning coalitions and deciding whether or not a voter is critical on all of those winning coalitions. That can take some time, but it's a fairly straightforward process. We list out all the winning coalitions. We count how many times each individual is critical. All right. That work? And then we create a ratio. So let's do a small example here. So here's an example where the quota is 21. Now let's list out all of the winning coalitions. To start with, again, quota is 21. So all we have to do is to say what coalitions, what groups add up to 21 votes. Well, A and B do not. No individual has 21 votes, right? So all of the single individuals by themselves, they're out. So let's go for pairs. A and B doesn't. A and C does not. A and D does not. So all the pairs with A don't work. B and C do. So I write down winning coalition, B and C. B and D do. Winning coalition, BD. C and D do. They get us up to 21. So the BC, BD, and CD, all of those pairs work. Now let's look at triplets. A, B, C, that works. In fact, I think all of the triplets work, don't they? A, B, C, A, B, D, A, C, D, and then last triplet is B, C, D. So all of the triplets work, and then obviously all four together, A, B, C, D together work. So I'm getting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different winning coalitions possible. Okay, these. Now, what I like doing is I like creating a big ring. All right. So what I do, basically, is I take each one of these winning coalitions, try it this way. And I ask, is A critical? Is B critical? Is C critical? Is D critical? Oops. To each one of these winning coalitions. And what I do is I generally just put either a yes, no, or a 1, 0. Doesn't really matter. Is that right? Okay. So is A critical? So let's look at BC to start out with. Is A critical to this? BC. Obviously not. It's not in there, right? So let's put a 0. Is B important to this? Yeah. If you drop B, you no longer win. So put a 1. Is C important? Yeah. If I drop C, I no longer win. D is not critical because it's not in it. The same way for BD. If I drop B, no longer wins. If I drop D, no longer wins. The other two are not in there, so they don't count. How about this one? C and D. Yeah, if you drop C, D no longer wins. If you drop D, C does not win by itself. So C and D are critical. A is not. All right, A, B, C. If I drop A, B, C still wins. A, therefore, is not critical. If I drop B, AC does not win. And all I'm doing is I'm dropping B and I'm saying, is AC a winning coalition? It's not, right? I already listed them out. If I drop C, AB is not a winning coalition. So both B and C are important, are critical to that coalition. Everybody okay with that? How I'm doing this? I know I'm going through pretty quick. If I drop A, B, D still wins, so A is not important to that coalition. If I drop B, A, D does not win, so B was important. If I drop D, A, B does not win, therefore D was important. And then C is not in there, so it's obviously not a critical play. Go to the next one. Drop A, C wins, A was not important. Drop C, A, D does not win. Oops. B is not in there. So C is important. C is important. Drop D. A, C does not win. Therefore, D is important. Okay with that? Now let's check out B, C, D. If I drop B, C, D still wins. B is not important, therefore, to this coalition. If I drop C, B, D still wins. So C was not important. If I drop D, B still wins. D was not important there as well. And A is obviously not even in that coalition. So notice in this winning coalition, there are no critical players. You can drop any one of them and still win. Now let's move down to here. Drop A, B, C, D still wins. Drop B, A, C, D still wins. Drop C, A, B, D still wins. Drop D, A, B, C still wins. So again, no winning, no critical players in this winning coalition. You can drop any one of them and still be all right. Now, the critical counts, therefore, notice A was never critical. So the critical count for A is 0. The critical count for B is 4. The critical count for C is also 4. And the critical count for D is also 4. So we would say the Banzhaf power index. A has a Banzhaf power index of 0/12, which is just 0, right? B has a Banzhaf power index of 4/12. Everybody understand where I'm getting the 12 from? I just summed up all of those. I summed up 0 plus 4 plus 4 plus 4 gives me 12. C also has a Banzhaf power index of 4/12. And D also has a Banzhaf power index of 4/12. So with a quota of 21, the Banzhaf power index for B, C, and D are all 4/12s, or you can simplify to 1/3 if you like, but 4/12s. By the way, a third is basically like 33.3%, right? So each of these have the exact same power. Roughly, their power is 33.3% of the system. And A has no power in the system. Does that make sense? So with a quota of 21, even though all of these weights were different, D has the same power as B. A has no power. They're a dummy voter, essentially, almost. And then C and B and D, even though they have different weights, have the same power, right? They have the same ability to produce an effect. Does that work? Oh. So that's what I usually do. I usually list out all of the winning coalitions and I make a table. And then I decide whether each of these voters are critical or not. The hardest part about this is making sure you don't miss any of the winning coalitions. Because obviously if I miss CD as a winning coalition, then all of my numbers get thrown off at the end. So, or any of them. So make sure that you list out all the winning coalitions. And then I 0 1 for if they're critical or not. 0 if they're not critical, 1 if they are critical. That way, when I add things up, I'm just adding a bunch of 1s and 0s. It's pretty easy to add up. Okay? And this is what I just wrote down. Critical count was 0, 4, 4. Bonds off power 0, 4 out of 12, 4 out of 12, 4 out of 12. Is that all right? Now, here's what I'll do. I'm not quite done with the power stuff yet, but it's not going to take very long to finish up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to finish up this power stuff next class period. And also, I'll get into the Electoral College notes as well. I'll do that real quick. So I'll do another example of the bonds of power, or another couple of examples. You actually have all the tools you need to complete this homework right now, though. All right. So if you want to do the homework 6-4, 6-5 right now, that'll be perfectly all right. We'll do that, or you can do that. And on Thursday, I'll come back, I'll finish that stuff up. We'll probably have some time at the end, so if you do have any questions over any material from chapters 5 or 6, that's going to lead us into the test. Just let me know. Get there. All right. Any questions? No? All right. Well, then I will see you on Thursday.